Well, good morning, everybody. I think this is the last time that we're going to meet this way. Um, Next week, we're scheduled to go back to worship. It won't be full worship because we still can't sing, I don't think. But, things are moving in a positive direction so quickly that I think we're going to be back to some kind of new normalcy pretty soon, which is I'm pretty excited about, barring any unforeseen development. The online stuff is going to continue in some way. I'm not sure whether I'm just going to record the service like I was, or whether I'm going to do something else. But this is probably done, and I enjoyed it, but I'm kind of glad to be back to normal. And it'll be pretty exciting to actually talk in person and be together and go back to doing church things. We had some pretty cool stuff in the works before the pandemic. We've come up with some pretty cool stuff during. I'm excited. Anyway, that's not what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about David today. David is seen as the high point, or one of the main high points of the Bible. Jesus is obviously, sort of the trajectory and main character, and we're trying to move towards this perfect world again. But the monarchy is sort of this high point, and David is just one of the absolute heroes of the Bible. And everything sort of after is measured against David. Even Jesus is measured against David. And we know that through the genealogies and the fact that the gospel writers felt it important to just drive home that there was a connection between Jesus and David. And he was constantly being measured, and people were asking, is this the new David? But the question is, was David's time really that great? Archaeologically, the record does not support that David was as good as we think it was. David's kingdom, we know that David's kingdom existed and David existed. Generally, we think that it was a lot smaller and less important than the Bible would have us believe. And historians, I think, generally agree at this point that the monarchies were never united. Maybe it was one of those things where David claimed to be in charge of both northern and southern kingdoms, but it's generally thought that the two kingdoms developed apart. So archaeologically, probably not all it was cracked up to be. But, even from a biblical perspective, I'm not sure it was all it was cracked up to be. If you look at the overall arc of the Bible on a chronological order, we're going from Eden to monarchy and exile and all the fallout of that, which includes the Gospels, because the Gospels they're really linked to the exile, to the apocalypse. And the apocalypse is really supposed to be a return to Eden. We have this perfect world, and we went away from it because of self-interest and protectionism and lack of wisdom and all these things. And Jesus is trying to show us how to get back to whatever the actual real life version of that garden is. And, that tells me that from a biblical perspective, the monarchy is not actually all we think it's cracked up to be. Obviously the ideal is the garden, and Jesus, who is really the only hero in the Bible without a flaw, he's not really political. He's very interested in culture. And the way I think about it is if the culture's healthy, then the government will reflect the culture. Jesus is not interested in government. That's a tool. Jesus is interested in culture change, independent of the government. So I really just don't see the biblical support for the monarchy, other than the fact that it's kind of the climax of the story, or it's the penultimate climax. And if we're not sure about that, the prophet Samuel, who's a major biblical figure, prophesies against monarchy. The people are this loose group of nomadic tribes. They're kind of, moving around and not settled. There's no unifying government. Each tribe maybe had a chief, but that was kind of it. And they had these loose group of judges that would sort of pop up once in a while to help them through hard times. But there wasn't any unifying thing other than the religion, and even that might be questionable. And the people saw the surrounding groups organizing, and they demanded a king. And, that makes a lot of sense, because if the groups around you are organized, that means they can fight you more easily, they can take advantage of you more easily, they can have a strategy and implement it, whereas a loose group of people can't. They can just exist. But remember, going back to the garden, that's kind of what the Bible wants. The Bible kind of wants you to just exist and not be, trying to climb the ladder all the time. But, it's scary when your neighbors are organized. And so they demanded a king, and Samuel says, hey, you realize that if you have a king, you're dependent on that human being. And that's really problematic. Human beings have flaws. And if you're dependent on a human being, you're gonna fall. And Saul is sort of the perfect example of that. Saul was good at the beginning, but Saul had a mental health problem. And today we would say, hey, mental health is not your fault. It is a health issue, just like, a physical health issue is a health issue. And, that's not Saul's fault. But because Saul got sick, he couldn't lead anymore effectively, and Israel suffered for it. It puts all your eggs in those baskets. And that's what David's mourning here. David is mourning that they've put all their eggs in the one basket. He's lost his friends because of it, and now there's this power shift, and this is the issue. Now, I've said that the monarchy's not all it's cracked up to be, but I want to spin it around and look at it from the other angle for a minute, because really it's all about perspective. The archaeological record says that it's not as good, or it's not as grand as the biblical record. But if you were one of David's contemporaries, going from a loose tribal system to a kingdom in 20 years, that was huge. From a perspective, like, that was just tremendous. And if you are 300 years later trying to write these stories down in exile, you don't have the tools of historic record. It was an oral tradition. An oral tradition only works if you have everybody constantly telling the stories to each other. And Israel realized this and went, hey, we have to write this down before we lose it, because we've been scattered around the countryside. There's nobody to tell the stories in groups anymore. They were removed enough that they were filtering David's reign through their modern perspective. They would have really needed to remember David more grandly than they were now, because these stories were meant to hold a scattered culture together. So that perspective would have really brought David up. And so I can see why, from a biblical perspective, the people needed that vision of David. But David was human, just like the rest of us. And there's a bunch of stories. The most obvious one is David and Bathsheba, but there's a bunch of stories about David just being incredibly human, even though he's this high point. And we can sort of envision all of this playing out in David's lament, because the Bible's written understanding that it was written considerably after the actual events, and it's meant to be read over and over again, and so it understands that the beginning of the story and the end of the story, and you're reading every time you read the story, you're going to understand something a little bit more about it. And so all this is playing out in David's lament. The idea that monarchy is not really the ideal, that the garden is the ideal, and they're trying to get to that garden, but this is where they are now. The challenges of monarchy and putting all your faith in the king, and the just human missteps. It's all playing out, and the point is, it's all incredibly complicated. Even though the garden was what everybody was working towards, monarchy is what they felt they needed at the time. And as far as the Bible is concerned, even though that's not the goal, it is what they needed at the time. It's part of the journey that led them to where we are today even. But, without the rise and fall of monarchy, there couldn't be a setting for Jesus to do what Jesus needed to do. So everything has its point, and it's complicated. And I was thinking about this and how it plays out today, and I've had, there's a lot of just racial stuff going on right now, and so I kind of want to talk about race again. It's been a year since George Floyd, and they're finding mass graves in residential schools, and we're going to find more. I think we need to recognize that these were large institutions in a time when that's just how they dealt with things. And these were children that the authorities in a lot of cases didn't care about. It was a time of tuberculosis and smallpox. If you ever want to read something tragic, read about the smallpox epidemics in residential schools. So this isn't, now that they're finding more of these mass graves, they're going to start looking for more, and they're going to find them. And so we're thinking about that, and we're just thinking about how just general things play out. And I guess what I'm thinking about is how everything's sort of linked and just how complicated everything is. Yeah. And where I want to get with this is this understanding that I think the better things get, the harder it is to see the blind spots. So, if we can put ourselves back in the civil rights era, and a bunch of you probably can, we can really clearly see that residential schools don't exist anymore, and that's a huge victory. Or that, segregated buses and water fountains in schools and stuff don't exist anymore. I think we're even to a point, there's still clearly people, and I'm talking mostly about the Canadian context at this point, because I guess I'm not, I'm talking about the North American context, but I'm going to scale into the Canadian context for a minute. I think there's this sense that you can't, we all know that if you have certain racial opinions, even though they're still out there, you can't talk openly about them. There's this term called dog whistling that I think everybody needs to keep in mind. And that is when someone with, prejudicial opinions wants to talk publicly about them, there's a certain sort of encoding that's used to sort of throw off general audience, but speak to their audience. And the classic example in Canada is when Stephen Harper referred to old stock Canadians in a debate about refugees and immigration. He means white people. And he was trying to speak sort of in a code that people would pick up on. And that's dog whistling. And I think it really, it says something. Like, there's a certain victory there when even folks with racist ideologies know that they can't speak them openly. That means we have arrived somewhere. But it also means that if there is prejudice of some sort or injustice or whatever, it's harder and harder to see. And we're not in the perfect world yet. And as I was thinking about how to sort of describe this, I was thinking about the fact that, like, everybody has, a place in their history where they were comfortable, or an ideal that they're sort of reaching towards. A lot of people, the 1950s, right? Like, the 1950s was this idyllic time. It was the post-war boom. Society seemed innocent. It seemed the rules were fairly clear. There's this vision that the 1950s were this idyllic time. But not everybody was idyllic. It was idyllic if you were a certain kind of person, usually white male. For some people, the 60s is this perfect time because people were asking questions and there was new music and there was new expressions and it was very, there was social change happening. But again, not everybody found the 1960s great. The 70s, 80s, 90s, we all have these times where for whatever reason we can look at them as this great time. As a millennial, I think right now is pretty good. I am really pleased with some of the things that are going on because, even when we talk about injustices, we're looking for them and we're trying to get over them and we're trying to fix them. I think that's pretty cool, and there's some neat stuff happening. I'm excited about this time to be alive. The problem is, if we sort of assume that we've arrived, then we're going to stop looking for that injustice. We're going to stop trying, and we're obviously not in that garden that we're supposed to be aspiring to. We're still somewhere in the monarchy. And what really scares me with racial stuff in particular is if we stop looking, or if we sort of assume that we've gotten to a certain place, then that undercurrent, that stuff that we don't realize, it's going to get stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And I think it is. I think it is happening. Yeah. And so as I was thinking about it, maybe the quippy way to say it is the only time when we can assume that we're not on our Christian journey. The only time we can know that we're not on our Christian journey is when we've stopped moving. And especially for folks that they've worked and they've accomplished things and everything, it's easy to say, I want to rest now. Or, hey, look at how far things have come. And yeah, they have. Things have been accomplished. But we can't use that as an excuse to sit down and rest for too long. You got to rest when you need to rest, but we can't use it as an excuse to slow down. And as I was thinking about, David's psalm, or David's lament, and how it was just expressing the complication with what was going on. And as I was looking at the news that's happening, and has been happening for the last year, it's all complicated. But if we don't recognize that we're on a constant journey and we've not arrived yet, then we know that we're not going to arrive. So let's do our best to keep moving, to keep looking for the good things that are happening now, to be ready to be critical and search for things to be critical of that are happening now, and not try and go back, but to try and keep working towards an exciting future. Amen.